Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Integration or Decoupling, What Lies Ahead. This is the first of two webinars on the topic of the US elections and the future of the trade war, brought to you by the Long US-China Institute at UC Irvine. If you're interested in registering for the second webinar, which will be on the topic of class politics and the trade war, that will take place on December 1st, and we will drop the registration link for that in the chat. Also, if you're interested in signing up for the Long Institute's mailing list, or if you want to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, we'll put the link for those in the chat as well. So over the weekend, the Associated Press declared Joe Biden the winner of the presidential elections and the next president of the United States. Now, many people greeted this announcement with a sense of optimism and relief, but the response in China has been a little bit more mixed. A professor at Renmin University in Beijing noted in the South China Morning Post that a Biden victory doesn't necessarily mean a better relationship between the US and China. Because Biden has historically taken a tough on China stance, at least throughout the lead up to the presidential elections, many people believe he'll continue to advance Trump's trade war, or perhaps even push for further disengagement so as to reduce American dependency on Chinese goods. So what will a Biden presidency mean for the US-China trade war? To find out, I am going to turn the conversation over to my colleague, Samantha Vortherms, who is going to moderate the event today. Professor Vortherms is an assistant professor of political science here at UC Irvine, and she is going to introduce our panelists and handle the Q&A at the end of the session. If you'd like to ask a question at any time, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and we'll collect the questions and ask them on your behalf. So I will turn it over to you now, Sam.
Thank you, Professor Baum, and thank you for everyone joining us this afternoon. I'm very excited to moderate this discussion among three rising stars in international relations, studying China, the US, to talk about some of the consequences of what's going on. So we have three panelists. First, we're going to have Professor Jack Zhang speak about the current state of the trade war. Then we'll have Professor Weiyi Shi talk about US-China decoupling in a little bit more detail. And then we'll finish out with Yeling Tang, Professor Yeling Tang, to talk about the different ramifications of the trade war for China, international and multilateral organizations, and regional and bilateral organization. So first, we're going to start off with Professor Jack Zhang. Dr. Jack Zhang is an assistant professor of political science joining us today from the University of Kansas. Professor Zhang, like all three of our panelists today, is an international relations specialist who studies political economy, Chinese politics, and US-China relations. Professor Zhang's work has been published in the Journal of Contemporary China, the Oxford Handbook on the Politics of Trade, and the Encyclopedia of Foreign Policy Analysis. Today, he is joining us to give a primer on the current state of the trade war, how it unfolded, and some of the immediate consequences. Thank you, Professor Zhang.
Okay, thank you so much, Sam and Emily, for having me. Could I get a verbal confirmation that my slides are running? And then I'll
yes, they're running. You're good to go.
Perfect. All right, thank you. Yeah, it's so nice to be here to talk about this topic. We decided with the Division of Labor that I'll give a little bit of an overview. So what I'll do today is give an after-action review, which if you are familiar, after military engagement, oftentimes the participants get to discuss what happened, why it happened, and how it can be done better. And we're going to do that with the US-China trade war. So to begin with, we're now about 3 years into the largest trade war since Smoot-Hawley. Average tariffs on Chinese goods have increased from an average about 3% to over 20%. And a parallel has happened on the Chinese side as well. This remains the case after the so-called Phase 1 trade deal. And the volume of goods covered, the majority of goods traded between the US and China now are under the effect of tariffs. For those who are not familiar with what tariffs are taxes that are paid by the importer of goods on imported goods. So this is essentially a 20% markup on goods that are coming in from China. And the brief sort of state of play of where the trade war is that it's become a war of attrition. This is a picture of the National World War I Museum and Memorial here in Kansas City, where I'm located. And you know, the analogy of the trench warfare and stalemate that characterized World War I think is an apt one to apply to the trade war today. Except the difference is that in this trade war, rather than being fought with bullets and soldiers, businesses and consumers are suffering with these tariffs. They're suffering in the trenches, and it's being fought with dollars and cents. And so here I have an illustrative example of a category of good that is covered by these tariffs, imported washing machines, which in 2016 cost about $100 less than if you were to purchase them in 2019. I painfully discovered this as I started at KU just after these tariffs came into being, and so was lucky to become a homeowner, and so to furnish that home with white goods, furniture, a range of these things that are on the tariff list proved to be quite expensive. But I think for average consumers, if you're not paying attention to historical trends, right, it may be easy to forget or to not notice the fact that tariffs are being put in place. They're buried and passed on to consumers through incremental increases in cost. And in this example, right, a decrease in the amount of sales that retailers are willing to make. But New York Times estimates that the median family is paying about $1,000 more for goods as a result of the trade war, to give you a sense of the scale. Turning next to how businesses in the United States are impacted by this and responding to this, I did a survey in partnership with the Kansas City Chamber of Commerce and the Princeton Trade Study, where we asked members of the KC Chamber how much they've been harmed or helped by tariffs. The vast majority, 76%, say that they've been harmed. Only 16% say they've been helped, and the majority also reflect that suppliers have increased prices as a result of the trade war. About 70% have experienced price rises from their suppliers, and we didn't ask sort of how they priced that out to consumers, but it's safe to say a large portion of them have passed that cost on to consumers like you and I. A little bit about the international politics of the trade war. I think it's important to note, and we can discuss in greater detail in the Q&A, that tariffs are applied as a means of leverage to achieve other goals here, right? The tariffs are not the end goal in mind in the trade war with China. It started in particular over issues of industrial policy, which my fellow panelists will talk about in greater detail. And you can look into in the Section 301 sort of reports, but they are a means to get China to change certain economic policies. And on the Chinese side, the retaliatory tariffs that have been put into place also serve a political purpose. They're a means of leverage, especially in the early waves of tariffs. They've been targeted at states and counties that show high amount of political support for President Trump. Agricultural states like mine in Kansas and neighboring Nebraska are among some of the hardest hit. And so this is the international dimension of what's going on. Now, turning a little bit to domestic politics, right? The politics of the trade war has been essentially trying to hurt your opponent with as much as possible while trying to keep your political supporters from suffering. So this figure here shows the trade exposure of states in the US. As you can see, again, Kansas comes out strong in both. It's hurt both in terms of as an importer of goods, like parts and components, especially intermediate goods that are used as part of production. It's also hurt in terms of exports. So the tariffs that China has put into place on products like US soybeans all hurt exporters in the United States. And so the politics in both countries are trying to minimize the political fallout that have resulted from these tariffs for as long as they can until the other side hopefully changes their minds and gives up. And in the US, what that looks like is compensation, a large sort of federal bailout for farmers. So President Trump is want to claim that China, all the China's paying for the tariffs, which is not true, but also that this is getting paid out to American farmers, which has a ring of truth here, right? The revenues gained from tariffs levied on Chinese imported goods right about equal the amount of subsidies that have gone out to American farmers. And these rural districts, of course, important for President Trump's re-election. And this is a political calculus that was made. I'd like to end sort of the sort of overview portion with one of my favorite case studies that have emerged on this. You can look at case studies like this for a number of product categories. I'm going to focus on drones. So you have here a picture of 2 drones, and I want the audience member to think about which of these is a national security risk, right? If you are familiar with the brands, you'll know that DJI Mavic drones are produced by DJI, which is a company in China based out of Shenzhen, very popular among hobbyists. And the company you have probably never heard of, Altavian, produces a Galaxy drone that basically has the same features and capabilities. But if you look at the price tags, about like 20 times more expensive, right? And so as the point of the case study is to think about, right, what is national security, right? And Altavian has lobbied very hard for drones to be included in subsequent tariff lists as a result of the trade war. And they've also effectively lobbied for their product to be added to the Pentagon's list of approved vendors for drones, right? So this is the state of play on this product category. And I think the question that we should ask ourselves is, right, if we believe that maybe, right, because DJI is a private company, but it's a Chinese company, do we want, trust them to process all the photos that have been taken from the drone? And depending on where you stand on this issue, you might have a valid national security concern, right? But think about how much that national security concern is worth to a drone hobbyist, right? And given the choice in the market, right, how willing they are to pick between these 2 products. That product is still sort of available in the U.S. domestic consumer market, but is no longer, after policies of the Trump administration, is no longer available for purchase by the government. And this question about national security actually also comes to play in the trade-offs that government agencies have to face. Right now, the Pentagon has the budget needed to fill its drone needs by purchasing these $15,000 drones from Altavian and like U.S. sort of drone makers, right? But other departments may not have these resources. Take, for example, the Department of the Interior used to actually source quite a few of their drones from DJI because they're cheap, they're very reliable, and they did their job, among which was to monitor the wildfires and give early warning. And so this became an issue, in your neighborhood and in the vicinity around UC Irvine with the wildfires this summer, because after the approved vendor list was passed, Department of Interior no longer able to buy Chinese drones and was not necessarily able to replace them with more expensive domestic alternatives. And as a result, right, there's a national security implication too. So here you're weighing wildfires, right, versus what data security, and this just goes to characterize sort of the difficulty we face in this kind of issue. Moving ahead to talk a little bit about the challenges and sort of assess where we are today. Of course, the phase 1 trade deal was signed in January 2020. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but the important one to highlight is that most tariffs remain in place. 25% tariffs still cover $280 billion worth of imports. And the reaction from industry to this trade deal has been mixed. It's been called at best a truce or a ceasefire, right? Because it leaves so much of these taxes in place. And it goes some ways to resolve issues like intellectual property and so forth. But by far the largest sort of piece of the phase 1 trade deal has been the agreement of China to purchase more American goods and to try to address the trade deficit in that way. So how's that going? Research from the Peterson Institute show that it's not going particularly well. We are about half, China's in the middle, towards the, going into November, almost the end of the year, is about half of the way to meeting these purchase agreements. And here you see the breakdown across a few different sectors. We're not close to meeting these purchase agreements under the phase 1 deal, and they're not likely to be met by the end of the year. Now, a lot of this is due to the unforeseen, right, COVID-19 pandemic, but an open question moving forward and for the Biden administration is what to make of this deal where one of the main components of it is not going to be met. Another way to assess the phase one trade deal could be in terms of the relative success on a policy dimension, right? And President Trump sold the trade war in terms of bringing jobs, American manufacturing jobs, back from China. And so with Professor Vortherms, we have a new working paper looking at data that she's collected on we have a universe of foreign registered, foreign invested companies in China. And we look at them before and after the trade war to see if they are in fact leaving. This figure here shows that we don't really see a statistically significant difference between the exits of American companies compared to others like South Korea, Taiwan, Canada, and so forth. From what we do know, right, even those companies that are exiting are not necessarily coming back and creating jobs in the United States. Here we have another piece of analysis from that paper where we looked at a range of domestic and foreign international sort of factors on what is likely to drive companies, multinationals, to be leaving China. How much has the trade war turned on the heat for supply chains in China? And we find basically that international factors like tariffs, like whether you're a US ally or not, like whether you're from a democratic country or not, don't seem to drive the decision-making of companies to exit China. What does drive decision-making are all traditional kind of business factors. The larger the company is, the less likely they are to exit. The longer they've been in China, the less likely they are to exit. If they are registered to a tax haven, like the Cayman Islands, they're less likely to exit China. And all of these are correlated, right, with political savvy of these of companies and political resources they have. And so the large kind of companies that are in China are staying there. And to the degree that exits are happening, it's hurting small and medium enterprises. One other finding to highlight here is that we find a statistically significant relationship between whether a company is registered in an industrial park in China, these development zones that the government has produced, they decrease the likelihood of firms exiting, right? And so these purely sort of business factors are driving this, and tariffs, surprisingly, have not had an impact on moving supply chains out of China. So to wrap up, what are the challenges that lie ahead for the Biden administration? I think it's safe to say the Biden campaign advocated a range of industrial policies, some of which are arguably more protectionist than even what the Trump administration has proposed, especially the supply chains plan to try to move supply chains and keep essential sort of critical products being manufactured now abroad, move those back at home. But looking to what an administration is likely to do, right? All signs point to the fact that they have to focus on domestic issues like the pandemic, and they're going to have a difficult appetite for difficult negotiations like the phase one, potential phase two deal. There's going to be a debate within the Biden administration about whether or not there should be a reset with China, and whether ending the trade war on China will be make the administration look soft on China. And I think what I would say is that the administration therefore faces a tension between the ends and means they're trying to achieve by tariffs, right? The ends of creating prosperity again for American manufacturers and generating jobs may not actually be compatible with the means of using tariffs or trying to shift supply chains. And so a choice has to be made, right, about whether we value sort of the outcomes or whether we value sort of the promised instruments. And I think it's going to be incumbent on a Biden administration to frame the trade war not as being soft on China or not in giving concessions to China, but rather on whether these policies, assess whether these policies that were put in place by the Trump administration has helped or hurt American businesses, and look at the evidence there and frame it that way to avoid the accusation of being potentially soft on China. So to conclude, the policies that we've seen in the Trump years have really blurred the gap between economic and security issues, and I think this blurring has been overall counterproductive. The U.S. businesses and consumers have conclusively been harmed by tariffs, and the phase one deal has failed to address many of the policy objectives, the same policy goals that going into the trade war remain unaccomplished. And there's limited evidence that decoupling is happening and supply chains are responding to this kind of pressure of tariffs. Tariffs have had no impact on firm exits in China, as our research show. And so what I will conclude on is that I think confronting China with tariffs is not a sound strategy for rebuilding American economic competitiveness. I think that resilient supply chains, our research shows, larger and more politically savvy companies are staying put despite the pressure these tariffs have produced. And that for the US, right, to attract these companies and create the 21st century jobs, the US really needs to deliver on good governance and greater investment in things like infrastructure and research and development here at home and compete on those merits, right? Two ways to win a race, right? You can run faster, or you can try to sabotage your opponent. We've tried the sabotaging with the tariffs, and I think this is time looking ahead to run faster. Thank you, and sorry for going a little bit over.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang, for giving us a big picture overview and some concrete examples of the effect of this trade war. And just a reminder to the audience, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A tool, and we'll return to Q&A for all of our presenters at the end of the presentations. Now we're going to turn to Professor Weiyi Shi from UCSD. Dr. Shi is an assistant professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego, primarily focusing on China's outward direct investment. Professor Shi's research evaluates Chinese firms' trade and investment behaviors and the role of state influence in firm behavior. Her research can be found in journals such as Research and Politics and the Journal of Politics. Professor Shi will further situate the trade war in the broader context of US-China decoupling and strategic competition. Thank you, Dr. Shi.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Emily, and thank you, Jack, for giving us a really nice overview. And thanks to the audience for dedicating precious time in your day to yet another Zoom session. So without further ado, here are some of the main points I kind of want to cover today. So as we heard from Jack, it's pretty apparent that trade wars are costly to both sides. So I want to actually take a step back and think about why the US and China trade war happened. Because in a way, figuring out where we came from is important for knowing where we're going, anticipating where we're going. And as Jack said, even though the principal weapon in the trade war is tariffs on goods, but the trade war is actually not about that. It's not about tariffs per se. And it's a war that's occurring amid rising US-China tensions across a wide range of issues. So 3 things I want to talk about. Number 1, just how this perfect storm was made that gave rise to the outbreak of US-China trade war. I want to touch on Trump's populist base and the American business community's rising frustration, growing frustration with China's longstanding trade practices leading up to the trade war, intensifying contests between US and China for technological leadership, and finally a growing sense of strategic competition on the part of the US with an increasingly assertive China in a global system. And trade mixed with geopolitics can be pretty dangerous. And I'm going to here touch on China's strategic framing of the trade war and how that could be potentially worrisome. And finally, I'm going to anticipate the future. And specifically, I'm going to present some really preliminary results from a public opinion survey. That's quite literally fresh off the survey platform. The data was just collected in September, October, leading up to just a few days before the election. And what we see, there are some promising signs in the public response so far to the trade war and the public's commitment to globalization, especially in China, but also recognize that the underlying conditions that gave rise to the perfect storm in the first place, by and large, will probably remain the same going forward. So first, let's look at the backdrop of the trade war. And the first part of the story of this puzzle really is the pretty nice coincidence between the China trade shock and the rise of populism, this populist base in the United States. And what you see here are these two side-by-side maps of the United States, both tabulated with data collected shortly before the 2016 election. And what you see here is an almost perfect overlap between counties and commuter zones, these local labor markets, essentially, their exposure to Chinese imports and the turn to Republican vote share, rising Republican vote share in these same counties. And so in a way, it's not surprising that Trump's trade war in a way is delivering and responding to his core constituency. And at the same time, so the second component of the backdrop of the trade war is this rising American businesses frustration with some of China's longstanding perceived unfair trade practices. And here I put a quote from the American Chamber of Commerce president, William Zarrett, who said in 2017, not long before the outbreak of the trade war, that there is this growing sense that Western countries, including the United States, have been very open to Chinese exports, Chinese investment, and has helped China in the last 30 years with incredible growth, but there's not an equal measure of openness, market access, and respect for property rights and so forth on the part of China. And this has been the case, and the reform in China has been very slow in coming. This has contributed to the business community's growing frustration. And in the meantime, the third component of this backdrop is China's growing strategic protectionism for technological leadership. So Jack touched on this very quickly in his presentation as well. And I call this strategic protectionism because it's a little bit different from protectionist policies that we were economists talk about in the context of import substitution or infant industry necessarily. This is China's brand of industrial policy epitomized in this document, this strategy that's called Made in China 2025, that's really very much focused on a set of strategic and emerging technologies. And this very explicit and heavy-handed industrial policy approach created a backlash in the United States as well as elsewhere. And this approach of industrial policy kind of mixed together use of subsidies and trade discrimination in order to gain an advantage in typically uncertain emerging technological areas. And the feature with this type of technology is that the contest in these emerging technologies, for example, artificial intelligence, 5G, is not just competing for market shares or for setting international commercial standards. You add into it the potential of dual use, and dual use meaning that this technology has commercial application as well as being useful in military. And so that instantly activates this national security concern that Jack was talking about. And although this was not sort of, part of necessarily the tool or the trade war, the tool of the trade war mainly was tariff, but at the same time, the US, China were engaging in the trade war, we were also observing the US completing an overhaul to reform investment screening and export control regimes in the US, mostly targeting China's access to these emerging technologies. And of course, many in the audience would be familiar with the case of Huawei and micro semiconductor chips and so forth. And also this is related to Trump's policy in augmenting visa restrictions, disproportionately targeting Chinese students in science and technology. And the US was kind of the first to start these reforms. But it's actually started a round of investment screening regime reforms, primarily in OECD countries, industrialized economies. A lot of reforms have been happening over the last 5 years or so. So finally, the final component of this backdrop of the trade war is this growing sense of strategic competition within a more assertive China. So in 2019, for example, Fred Bergsten of Peterson Institute remarked that the current trade conflict between the United States and China is actually more than about a contest about trade, about trading relationships, and it is really a contest for leadership of the global economic system in the 21st century. And the U.S. national defense strategy, starting in 2018, stopped considering terrorism as the primary challenge facing national security in the United States, and instead considers interstate strategic competition, especially with China, with countries like China and Russia. So as you can see, even though this is not necessarily a political coalition, but this is a perfect storm, a storm sort of in the making for a long time, reflecting domestic political economy divisions, distributive conflicts from the United States participation in global trade, and also frustration with China's slowness to reform and open up its markets, and adding to that the changing technological landscape, and adding to that concerns about strategic competition with China. And often when we think about these things, sort of the link between commerce and security, it's always quite dangerous when the issue becomes framed in the context of geopolitics, a commercial issue being framed in the context of geopolitics and national security, because when it ultimately comes to it, countries are likely to do anything when they feel like their national security is threatened. So if that is sort of the backdrop for how the trade war broke out in the first place on the part of the U.S., what about China's side? So China was the party that was first attacked, or was unilaterally being imposed on the tariffs by the United States. But China did retaliate, and China adopted a framing of this U.S.-China trade war that's fairly exclusively framing it to be a geopolitical context. So as opposed to sort of the multi aspects, multi-factors that were giving rise to the trade war that we just talked about. China, this is what you see here are some of the figures made based on text analysis that Bo Liang, my co-author, and I have prepared by analyzing 75 Chinese newspapers in 31 provinces from January 2015 to late 2019 that mention U.S.-China trade in the title of the article. And then we look at how the Chinese newspapers choose to talk about the trade war. And it's overwhelmingly described as a strategy on the part of the United States to suppress China's development. And on the right here, you can see an example of a quote for this framing. And this strategy seems to, in a way, consistent with how the Chinese public do view the American motivation for the trade war. So this chart is made from public opinion data that we collected just finished collecting just a few days ago. So apologies for some of the rough graphics that we were still making up to a few hours before the presentation. So here you can see that vast majority of the Chinese public, when given these different reasons for why the United States may have started a trade war, vast majority chose that the reason is to contain China's rise. So what does that mean then? Does that leave us in a dangerous situation, even though many of us are breathing a sigh of relief now that Biden is expected to inaugurate sometime in January? So perhaps the public opinion data can offer us some clues. So for the sake of time, I'm probably going to run through the graphics very quickly. So I'm just going to describe what you're about to see first, because I'm not going to have a lot of time to actually stop on every graph. So what we find is that public in both countries, in the United States and China, believe that the Phase 1 agreement was a step in the positive direction. So that's the good news. And the two countries also public believe that they should continue trade negotiations. And also support for globalization generally is quite strong in China, but we do face limitation in that our China sample is entirely urban. We don't have any rural residents in our China sample. But the public in both countries believe that trading with one another can help reduce the chance of military conflicts between the two countries. So that's also another good positive. But the public also in both countries remain fairly suspicious of the other country's intentions. Most Americans believe China presents a threat, regardless of partisanship, and most Chinese believe the US will contain China's growth. And the public in two countries also have somewhat divergent views of what are the problematic issue areas are in bilateral relations. And for the United States, whether it's Republican or Democrat, actually human rights are considered a top problem area, whereas for China, it is different. We'll get to that graph in a minute. And Democrats and Republicans, surprisingly, perhaps not surprisingly, depending on what your prior is, do not differ dramatically when it comes to views about trade in China. But there are two dimensions where they are very different. One is that far more Democrats and then Republicans are prone to believe that bilateral relationship will improve with a new US administration, but far more Republicans and Democrats consider Chinese students and researchers to be a threat. So these are just some of the actual graphic presentation of what I just talked about. And so I'm going to have to go through these very quickly. So this is just showing almost vast majority support the Phase 1 agreement, both in the United States and in China. And vast majority want to continue to negotiate. And Chinese public, very supportive of globalization. It is actually quite interesting. Oops, that's just me timing myself, sorry. And so, but it's less so in the United States. And we also see in the United States, the public are less likely to think that they have personally benefited from globalization than their Chinese counterpart. And this is about containment. And this is about belief about trade helping to mitigate military conflicts. And these are differences in what issues are salient in bilateral relations. And we see that in fact, in the United States, it is human rights is an area of concern versus In China, the public tend to believe that it's US-China competition for making the next technological breakthrough as the primary concern. Okay, and then here, attitude toward Chinese students, this is an area where there is substantial partisan difference. So to summarize, the onset of the trade war was random. That Trump announced it on Twitter, and it was quite unanticipated. But the underlying political economic forces have been long in the making, and these forces will continue to be at play during a Biden administration, whether the current bilateral trade ends quickly or not. And to speculate, I would say the future of bilateral economic cooperation between the two countries will very much depend on how well the United States can address the negative impact of globalization, and whether China can truly embrace global rules and institutions, and especially when it comes to industrial policies, and whether the US can once again invest in these important global institutions, which Yeling will talk more about, so that the two sides can both collaborate and compete within a rule-based framework. Thank you.
I thank you very much, Dr. Shi, and that's a perfect segue into our last panelist, Dr. Yeling Tan. And Dr. Tan is an assistant professor joining us from the University of Oregon. Professor Tan's research focuses on the political economy of globalization in authoritarian regimes and how authoritarian regimes affect rulemaking at the international level. Her work can be found in comparative political studies, governance, the China Journal, and global policy. Professor Tan will introduce us to the international dimension, focusing on how US-China economic tensions have affected cooperation at the multilateral, regional, and bilateral levels, as well as discussing prospects for moving forward. Thank you, Professor Tan.
Thanks so much, Sam and Emily. And let me just share my screen quickly. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yes, you're good.
Great. So thanks again to the Long Institute for this very kind invitation and for organizing this very, very timely event today. So as Sam mentioned, I'm going to take a step back in my presentation and look at the trade war in a larger, big picture context, focusing on multilateral and regional cooperation. And I'm going to start by laying out 4 potential scenarios that the world could be moving towards in terms of global economic cooperation. And I differentiate these 4 scenarios by 2 characteristics. So first, on the vertical axis, the ease with which goods and services can move across borders, or simply put, the ease of trade. Secondly, on the horizontal axis, this question of whether countries choose to act unilaterally or whether they choose to cooperate with each other. And these 2 characteristics will bring us into these 4 different scenarios. So the first scenario, that of open international rules, is by far the most optimistic and in a sense represents the positive developments of global economic cooperation that the world had been moving towards since the end of the Second World War. In this scenario, countries are able to cooperate through multilateral institutions, such as the WTO or World Trade Organization, or complementary international frameworks. And the ease of trade is quite high in this state of the world. The second scenario is that of competing coalitions. Here, countries are still able to cooperate, but that cooperation is circumscribed by competing spheres. So this means that there are distinct barriers to global trade flows. It might be high within a sphere, but low across different spheres. So if you want to think about the US and China as different spheres, there'll be high barriers to economic exchange between these 2 regions. Moreover, the regional blocs and cooperative arrangements that do exist are not necessarily complementary with the rules of the multilateral trading order and might instead serve as substitutes to multilateral rules. moving forward, the third scenario is one characterized by the principle of sovereignty first. In this scenario, countries are unable to cooperate. They're acting by and large unilaterally in terms of their economic policies, and they enact barriers that inhibit the movement of goods and services, leading to a low ease of trade across borders. This generates inefficiencies, it generates high economic risks for everyone, geopolitical uncertainties, and an overall decline in productivity and innovation. And finally, the fourth scenario is one of technological disruption, where despite a lack of cooperation, we have technological advances that allow for the cross-border movement of goods and services, regardless of geopolitical circumstances or national policies. And in this world, technology is racing ahead of regulation, but economic exchange comes with high uncertainties as well as deep inequalities. So some might find themselves enjoying a risky but borderless world, while others have to grapple with inefficiencies. And this particular world, this particular scenario is a fairly futuristic projection. So for the purposes of our discussion today, I'm going to be focusing on the first three scenarios. So the open international rules, competing coalitions, and sovereignty first. And I want to start by taking stock of where we are now, right? Where the past few years have put us in terms of these three potential worlds that we could be moving towards. So starting with open international rules and multilateral cooperation, when it comes to multilateral cooperation and multilateral institutions such as the WTO, there has been clearly quite a lot of difficulties and struggles amongst countries to continue the multilateral cooperation. And I would say these struggles began even before the Trump administration. And I'll talk about some of these entrenched difficulties a little bit more in a few slides. However, the picture isn't all bleak. Countries have still been trying to push forward to forge common ground on issues such as e-commerce, regulation, investment facilitation. Some of the trade pacts that have been signed have the potential to complement existing WTO frameworks, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, also known as the CPTPP. You know, these have moved ahead despite the withdrawal of the US from the TPP back in 2016. So some positive movement amidst a very, very difficult situation overall. And as you can see from the slide, there has been a lot more action in terms of developments that push us towards a world of competing coalitions. On the Chinese side, there has been the Belt and Road Initiative that has aroused a lot of curiosity and interest both in the public and academic spheres. In Asia, regional agreements such as the Regional Cooperation and Economic Partnership, the RCEP, is going to be signed and finalized this weekend. More worrying, however, is the increased frequency of managed trade. So the phase one deal that Jack very concisely spoke about earlier is one very prominent example where governments, rather than letting firms and markets figure out who they want to trade with and where and when, governments step in to manage the trade and to pledge to purchase preset amounts of different types of goods. Many trade deals, such as the renegotiation of NAFTA, forged not on the principles of reciprocity and non-discrimination and principles of the WTO, but on issues more rooted in bilateral or regional politics. And finally, we have the US, the EU, and China divided over the principles that should undergird over which principles should undergird the governance of data flows. And big divisions have emerged, as Weiyi very, very clearly laid out for us previously. Divisions have emerged over this question of 5G technology and what to do with China's 5G technology champion, Huawei. So a lot of action taking place that is pushing the world towards these competing coalitions. And thirdly, a whole lot of action as well has been taking place in the sovereignty first scenario, We've seen, as Jack laid out for us very nicely, this tariff escalation between the US and China, but also tit for tat behavior in broader aspects of the economic relationship, such as visa restrictions, right? I restrict your visas, you restrict my visas, investment restrictions, right? In response to the US's export controls on semiconductor technology to China, China has also threatened to establish its own unreliable entity list. Quite worryingly, the US's invocation of the WTO's national security exception, this is an escape clause. When it imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum, the US invoked this national security exception to justify the imposition of its tariffs. It undermined an unspoken norm of restraint around the use of that clause at the WTO. What we've seen happen subsequently is Japan also invoking the national security exception in its dispute with South Korea. And the fear is that this escape clause might be used in increasingly unrestrained ways in the future. So taking a step back, looking at these three, what's happened so far in these three different scenarios and the big picture, I would say that we've been moving towards fragmentation rather than purely integration or purely decoupling. And the question is what lies ahead with a Biden administration. So in what follows, I'll divide the potential actions that we might see happening in a Biden administration into three categories. So first, low-hanging fruit that could quite, relatively easily be done. Secondly, feasible but politically difficult options. And thirdly, deeply entrenched issues that will be very difficult to resolve. So starting with the optimistic stuff, so low-hanging fruit. Trade in general, as others have mentioned, is likely to be a relatively low priority for the United States government relative to broader crises and urgencies such as managing the pandemic. However, certainly the US could take some action to strengthen multilateral cooperation in this optimistic world of building open international rules. This includes taking a more positive stance on the appointment of the next WTO Director General. Previously, the Trump administration had opposed the person who was the forerunner in the race at the moment. The US could also get some forward movement by working with like-minded allies such as the EU and Japan in this trilateral process that was started a few years ago. So restarting and kicking in a bit more energy in the trilateral process to find common ground on issues of WTO reform. So forging a little bit of consensus among like-minded parties to get more forward movement and energy going into these very, very tricky and entrenched issues that I'll talk about later. And it could also signal a more committed stance on moving ahead with negotiations on issues such as e-commerce and investment facilitation, just to get the sense of political will and energy going forward again at the multilateral level, despite trade being a relatively low priority, at least in the first few years of the Biden administration. When it comes to developments that have pushed us towards competing coalitions, the US could do a lot by not doing what it's been doing in the previous years, right? It could bring an end to the striking of mini deals and managed trade. So this doesn't necessarily mean resolving the existing negotiations with China or resolving the trade war in one fell swoop, but at least committing to no further escalation, either with China or with other countries. And finally, in terms of what's happened in the sovereignty first arena, the US could also bring an end to the tariff escalation. It could bring an end to the imposition of visa restrictions and potentially signal a shift away from the future use, from any future use of the national security exception. Again, this doesn't mean the lifting of tariffs that have already been levied, especially those imposed on China, but at least an end to unilateral protectionism and a commitment to de-escalating current tensions between the US and some of its major trading partners. So these are the relatively low-hanging fruit. Let me quickly talk about issues where we might see scope for change, but would be very politically difficult. In the multilateral arena, this includes the US joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or what's also called the CPTPP, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the AIIB. Both would be very difficult for different reasons. In the United States at the moment, there's very little political appetite and very narrow, weak base support within the Democratic Party for an aggressive trade reopening. Trade promotion authority for the president is also going to expire in June of next year. And moreover, the Biden administration's team has already signaled that it is likely to focus more on investing in US workers first, so that a domestic agenda is going to dominate over the prospect of rejoining this mega trade deal, mega trade arrangement. So it'll be difficult. And it'll also be difficult for the US to join the AIIB without being accused of being soft on China. The WTO's appellate body is currently in crisis, so it's basically hobbled the dispute resolution function of the WTO. And the US might adopt a more positive stance on trying to find common ground with like-minded countries for reform, rather than just blocking the appellate body appointments. Again, this is very, very politically difficult. In terms of regional competition, a very tricky and knotty issue is the question of how the US is going to treat China's Belt and Road Initiative. Should the US approach be to set up competing initiatives to the BRI, like the Blue Dot network, or should it take a different approach? I think there's likely to be differing views within the Biden administration on this question, and it's likely to depend on who gets appointed to the economic team and how much consensus there is within the team over the potential response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And finally, we come to a large set of issues for which differences are very entrenched, many of which precede the Trump administration. And Weiyi gave us a very good background as to how and where these tensions came about, and therefore why they're likely to persist. At the WTO level, there are many, many tricky issues that the US and China disagree on, and which in part have driven the escalation of the trade war in the first place. So this includes this question of whether or not China should be labeled a non-market economy in the resolution of certain trade remedy disputes, the governance of state-owned enterprises, Chinese industrial policy, questions over whether or not China should declare itself a developing country and therefore enjoy greater flexibilities granted to developing countries under WTO rules. All of these US-China differences sit at the heart of many of the tensions that block the forward movement of multilateral rulemaking in the trade arena. Entrenched differences on issues such as cyber sovereignty, security, data privacy are also likely to impede forward movement or cooperation on the governance of data flows and on 5G and the question of how to engage with or not engage with the Chinese company Huawei. This is likely to persist. And finally, we're unlikely to see a loosening of investment screenings around Chinese investments, nor a unilateral lifting of the existing export controls for semiconductor technology without a broader political deal being struck between the US and China on what the nature of the bilateral economic relationship is going to be like moving forward. So again, taking a step back, looking at the big picture, what the low-hanging fruit is, what the politically difficult issues might be and where the entrenched differences lie. There's definitely some actions that the US can take moving forward to strengthen multilateral cooperation around trade, but the overall picture of fragmentation, in my view, is likely to persist. We will see some efforts at integration continuing and hopefully strengthening to some degree. Differences that I just laid out mean that we're not going to see the end of tensions pulling the world towards competing coalitions, pulling the world towards defensive sovereignty. With that, I thank you very much for your patience in listening to my presentation, and I look forward to a great discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Tan. That was an excellent way to kind of round out our panel here on the trade war and our different perspectives on things. We have about just under 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So for those of you who are in the audience, if you have questions, just a reminder, you can type them into the Q&A section. And I wanted to start us off in the Q&A with just kind of a general comment about something that I found quite striking while listening to this panel, but also pulls in a question that we've received. So one of the, sorry, you might hear my dog in the background who has just decided she wants to be vocal. So one of the more consistent themes that we've heard this evening has been this kind of continuity, right? So that we have seen things like strategic protectionism, we've seen some of this hedging, especially by China, happening before the trade war. And so I wanted to ask if, thinking about the trade war in a comparative context, or in this linear historical context, do we think that if Biden walks back things like tariffs, is this likely to be seen as a credible commitment towards moving to some of those more cooperative quadrants, as Professor Tan pointed out? Or is it more likely that China's going to kind of continue to hedge its economic bets and diversify and go further along the strategic protectionism? Any thoughts?
I guess I could start by answering that it's always much easier to kind of harm your credibility than to build it back up again. And I think that the fact that the United States went through these 4 years of withdrawing itself from multiple multilateral organizations, initiating countless unilateral actions on China as well as other countries, is going to make countries think twice when interpreting the next policy signal from the United States. And hopefully, I mean, nobody knows. I mean, hopefully this, hopefully Biden's administration will be able to work with allies and recommit the United States to international institutions and build this reputation back up and really part ways from the America First regime. But again, it's easier to destroy a reputation, much easier than it is to restore it.
Yeah, I would agree with what Weiyi just said. I think that from the Chinese perspective, not just the Chinese perspective, but since we're talking about China, 4 years is a very, very short time. You know, and already the political conversation in the United States has turned to the midterms in 2 more years and whether or not Trump will run again in 2024. And so I think that what has happened in the past few years with the securitization of the economic relationship is very difficult to unravel. So merely lifting the tariffs alone does not de-securitize the economic relationship, right? So these deeply entrenched issues over what to do with Huawei and the technology competition, that lies at the heart of economic tensions between the US and China. So being able to lift tariffs is great in terms of de-escalating and getting some issues back on an even keel. But in terms of, I think in terms of the Chinese government's assessment of the overall picture, I don't think the overall picture changes very much, right? The lesson that the Chinese government has ingested over the past few years is that there are certain choke points that has made the Chinese economy very vulnerable to external blackmail, for lack of a better word, and to take steps to make sure that China never finds itself in that position again, right? Regardless of which administration comes along in the future. So the shift in China's overall economic policy towards building greater resilience around supply chains and critical technologies is unlikely to be shifted merely by the lifting of tariffs.
Professor Zhang, did you have something you wanted to add, or should I ask?
I can jump in, but I'll probably just chip in a little bit later. I agree with both Weiyi and Yeling.
Yeah. Excellent. So I wanted to ask a question that comes straight from our audience Q&A, which is about the removal of tariffs and allies and the role of allies. So the Biden administration has expressed a desire to coordinate actions against China with US global allies. Given potentially contradictory economic interests and distrust towards the US sown by the Trump administration, how much sway could the US hold over its allies in regards to China? Which allies are likely to be the most cooperative or the most uncooperative?
I could jump in and take a stab at this one and circle back on some thoughts. I mean, I think I agree with Yeling that this trend, there is definitely a trend towards the blurring of national security, right, and trade, and it's going to be a difficult one to untangle. But at the end of the day, right, it's difficult for states, for governments, right, to change the interests or convince countries or companies that their interests are fundamentally different, right? We're not going to see that succeed US to China and vice versa. And we're probably not going to see that even US with major allies in Asia or in Europe, right? Unless an alternative exists, right, that is addressing some of the risks, right, but also at a price point that is affordable, we're going to continue to see things like 5G sort of play out, right? The temptation to adopt cheaper Huawei 5G equipment. If you want 5G, there's all sorts of benefits to your economy. And if the US just tells you like, no, you can't have 5G, right? That's going to be less effective than if something is put into place, right, instead of it. And I think for most countries in the world and for most companies, right, I think everyone has some baseline, it varies a little bit, right? Baseline anxiety about political risks associated with China, about a more heavy-handed sort of government intervention in that economy. Yet, right, the price is right for a lot of goods and services that are provided, and companies and countries don't want to choose sides, don't want to be told what they have to purchase or not purchase, right? And so I think the emphasis should be less like on what we tell companies and what we tell our allies, but on providing and changing those underlying fundamental interests.
I think that whether or not the US will be able to successfully rally its allies around it kind of depends on the issue area. I think that self-interest will dictate how the alliances play out in the future. So if we look at something like data governance, for example, there are some very deep and potentially unbridgeable differences between the US and the EU when it comes to how to govern data, how important data privacy should be. And the US and the EU just exist in two different regimes. So to try to think that the US and the EU could come together, right, and cooperate with each other to try and forge some kind of broader agreement with China, I think is very difficult. There might be scope for cooperation between the US and the EU on other issue areas that are less politically contentious, right? And if the US wanted to rejoin the TPP, for example, it probably will raise some of the provisions that it had originally negotiated into the TPP, but then were dropped when the US pulled out. Will countries such as Japan be be so willing to accept these rather tricky provisions again, that is potentially unlikely, even though the US-Japan alliance is quite strong. So I think the US will need to sort of pick its way quite carefully moving forward, and really, really focus on areas where there is common ground, where the allies' interests and American interests can converge.
Excellent. Okay, so we're almost out of time, but I want to ask one more question because of its really timeliness for today. So just looking for a couple quick answers here, which is that today there was an executive order not allowing US investments in Chinese companies with ties to the Chinese military, which we of course see seems to be this also continuation with the visas that also have come up. So this audience member asks, could we see more of these executive orders over the next 2 months? Of course, this is, looking into your mystical, magical balls here. But do we think that there might be more bridge burning in the very near future?
Again, I am just speculating because really nobody knows what's going on in the White House. I think one could. I think one could certainly see more of these executive orders being issued over the next 2 months. And we could also expect to see when the Biden administration comes in, I think, in the first 100 days, it will develop a strategy to undo a large number of these executive orders. But I also agree with the other panelists in saying that some of the fundamental issues, the fact that the United States, as well as other countries, are always going to second guess the autonomy a commercial entity from China has, being from an authoritarian system, that's always going to be an outstanding issue. And what Yeling mentioned about a securitization of commercial competition, that is also going to frame the discussion for a long time to come. And both the U.S. and China have done their share to sort of securitize this discussion. And it would be great if we move to a framework where we can talk about commerce more in its own right. But I don't know how easy it is to get there.
All right, well, we are just about out of time. Again, I would like to thank our panelists, Zhang, Yeling, and Weiyi Shi, for a wonderful conversation, and also for Samantha Vortherms for moderating. Again, we are going to be having our second webinar on this theme of the US elections and the future of the US-China trade war on December 1st. I just dropped the registration link in the chat, and if you have the opportunity, please also take a moment and sign up for the Long Institute mailing list. So have a wonderful evening. Hopefully I will see you soon, and take care.
Thank you, Emily and Sam.
Thank you all so much.